Vijay Bhaskar, Professor from Madras Institute of Development Studies and a member of State Planning Commission. Sir, thanks for accepting our invite. A very warm welcome to you.
Thank you, Sam.
He's an excellent researcher. His research centers on political economy of development in Tamil Nadu and focuses more on labor and land markets and human development. Sir is having rich experience in several research projects and publications. He has co-authored the book on the Dravidian model, interpreting the political economy of Tamil Nadu. Actually, this book explains about Tamil Nadu's development in terms of political mobilization. Thank you for giving that contribution, sir. Also, Professor Vijay Bhaskar has also coordinated for the preparation of Tamil Nadu Human Development Report in 2017. In addition to publishing in numerous scholarly journals and in media outlets, he has co-edited monographs. First area of research is agrarian and rural change, rural-urban interaction, and this project is about rural development, and I'm sure you are the right person to address this, sir. On behalf of the entire project team, I welcome you to deliver today's lecture for this forenoon session. I take this opportunity to welcome our team members of project, our team leader, Dr. Uma Maheshwari, Professor and Head, Department of Politics and Public Act. Welcome, ma'am. Dr. Tamilarasan, Head, Department of Sociology. Dr. Manjula, Department of Management Studies. Dr. Eugene Rosetta from the Department of Education. And Dr. Mariappan from the Department of Econometrics. Dear team members, I welcome you all for this online workshop. Thanks for joining. And I also welcome all the faculty members and students from other city colleges who have joined in today's program. I welcome our project PDF, Dr. Gopi, and all our research fellows and field investigators. And to all our research scholars and the students, thanks for joining and welcome you all. So now I request our guest speaker, Professor Vijay Bhaskar, sir, to take over.
So thank you, Dr. Malathi. And I'd also like to thank Professor Uma Maheshwari and the rest of the project team for this invitation. And I happened to talk to Dr. Malathi yesterday about the scope of the project around which this workshop is being organized. Without any exaggeration, I must say, it's a very, very fascinating study. And particularly as a member of the State Planning Commission, we look forward to the findings of the study, because these things are very important. In fact, we have been going to rural Tamil Nadu, very early stages, of course, but we've at least made some 2 or 3 visits to villages in rural Tamil Nadu to look at service delivery, particularly in the domain of health and education. So I do realize how important this study is, not just for academic output, but also from the point of view of policy making.
Thank you.
Coming to the topic, of rural transformation. So before we go on to talk about how it has unfolded in Tamil Nadu, I think it's worth keeping in mind what kind of rural transformation is ideal from a theoretical point of view, or what development economics tells us. Because rural transformation can be of many types, but it's always good to get a sense of what is it that is considered good about particular kinds of transformation and what is not good. So if you look at the literature, when one talks about rural transformation, a key aspect that is kind of emphasized is this idea of modernization. So modernization, to begin with, has to do with adoption of modern technologies in agriculture, which will facilitate improved productivity. That is one. And second has to do with modernization of land and labor relations to ensure optimal resource utilization. Generally, this comes from the assumption that often the labor allocation and land allocation is done through customary practices. We do know land historically has been held by only a very small social group in the country, and that need not be the most efficient way of land allocation. They might not, the ones who possess land may not be the best ones to actually utilize land optimally. And similarly, labor relations, often, you don't have functioning labor markets. That is, I'm talking about the pre-modern, or what is often referred to as feudal relations. Often it is, again, whom you work for is determined by customary practices. So labor allocation again tends to be inefficient, and that has to change. So essentially, land and labor markets have to become modern. And the third is, of course, infrastructure. And Dr. Malati mentioned about how the study, is going to look at availability of infrastructure in these villages. And all these things put together, when one talks in terms of an actively functioning labor and land markets, improved agriculture productivity through incorporation of new technologies, then and of course better linkages through infrastructure with the rural and the urban, then one kind of anticipates a change in economic structure as well through the process of diversification. So the surplus tends to get generated within agriculture, and that can be used for investments in the non-agriculture or in the non-rural sector, which will also facilitate the movement of people away from agriculture and to the non-agriculture sector. So you find both economic activity and employment and livelihoods increasingly shifting away from agriculture towards the non-agriculture. Now, when one talks about this shift, it is useful to keep in mind whether the shift is taking place within the rural, or it is taking place through a shrinkage of the rural and expansion of the urban. So normally you make this distinction, particularly in the domain of employment. One can think in terms of rural non-farm employment, or the non-rural or the urban non-farm employment. Okay, so what is good and what is more ideal, that is something which we can discuss about. But conceptually, it is useful to keep this difference in our mind, for reasons which will come to later. So the key thing is modernization accompanied by economic diversification, both in terms of employment and in terms of economic activity. I'll not go into why this is the ideal case and so on. If required, later on, we can take this up during the point of discussion. Now, when you want to come to when we come to Tamil Nadu, we do know some of the broad aspects of Tamil Nadu's development trajectory. I will just go over it very quickly, just to recall. It is seen as one state which has been able to combine robust economic growth with reasonably good human development outcomes. Yeah, across several human development indicators, you would find Tamil Nadu would rank second or third. Whereas in economic activity, in certain aspects we rank at the top, and certain dimensions of economic activity we might rank second or third. Yeah, so no state has actually done that. So that is what is unique about Tamil Nadu's development trajectory. And we often forget that this has happened despite the fact we have been among one of the poorest states until the 1960s. So one important aspect of Tamil Nadu's development trajectory is that it has one of the best parameters of structural transformation, that is parameters of economic diversification. Okay, in line with what we just saw earlier about what is ideal rural transformation. Sorry about that. So what you find is that the share of agriculture in terms of both income and employment is one of the lowest in the country. Agriculture contributes only for about 7% of the total state GDP, whereas those dependent on employment is much higher. It's about close to between 30 and 35%. But the key thing is, even this 30 to 35% is much lower than in most states. To that extent, we have been relatively successful in this diversification, which we just spoke about, or what we want to happen. Though there's a mismatch between ability to reduce the share of income compared to ability to reduce the share of those who are dependent on agriculture for their employment. And we also have the highest share of labor in manufacturing, with 19% of the workforce employed in manufacturing, largest number of factories, and largest number of workers engaged in factory work. And again, as we all know, Tamil Nadu is the most urbanized state. And importantly, this urbanization, unlike in other urbanized states, it is more decentralized in the sense there are more urban centers. If you have a diffusion index of urbanization, you would find Tamil Nadu ranking at the top, which means villages have the potential to get themselves linked to nearby urban areas much better than most states in the country. Yeah. As a result of which, we also have one of the lowest levels of poverty. If you look at the recent Niti Aayog index on multidimensional poverty, as you must have read in the papers, we have one of the lowest multidimensional poverty levels in the country. We are placed second. But having said that, we also should be cognizant of the fact that 7.32% of the rural population in Tamil Nadu are multidimensionally poor. Okay, so it's useful to keep that in mind. Now, as Dr. Malathi mentioned in the book which I co-authored with my colleague Dr. Kalaiarasan, what we tried to show is that this development trajectory was shaped by political mobilization, particularly by the Dravidian mobilization, which saw the biggest hindrance to development of egalitarian and modern society and economy is the monopoly of caste elites over the modern economy and the public sphere. Okay, so it's not that they did not emphasize land as a source of power, but if you look at the nature of their conceptualization of what is wrong, for them, rather than land as a source of power, they felt that access to the modern economy and modern social sphere was much more important to ensure better redistribution, better in egalitarian development. So what you find is there's a much stronger emphasis on the movement to the urban, the industrial economy, and to the modern, as a route to freedom from caste oppression and to ensure social justice. So rural transformation away from agriculture was seen to be critical to realize socially just development. So that is kind of underlies that's at the core of the vision of development, and this in many ways has played a role in what we see is happening in Tamil Nadu at the moment. And how was this made possible? Primarily, it's a combination of interactions between social and economic policy interventions, which was meant to facilitate this transformation and modernization of the economy and society. So when you talk about social and economic policy interventions, this directly feed into the kind of issues that the project is supposed to engage with. You have a set of services which can be categorized as social. Then you also have a certain sets of services which can be deemed as in economic services. So if you look at the nature of interventions, tenancy reforms have played an important role in transfer of land from the traditional landowning classes to tenant farmers. It's not that they've always been successful, but it has seen a degree of success. But the extent to which agricultural laborers have benefited, clearly it has not happened as much as one would wish for. The second major axis of intervention is affirmative action policies in education and employment. We do know that Tamil Nadu has implemented 69% of affirmative thing, which is much higher than any other state. And these action policies have also expanded and deepened over time. Within a particular caste category, you find relatively caste groups which have not benefited enough. So you create separate quotas within these categories and so on. So there have been issues with that, but then, you do find that happening over time. The other important axis of intervention is in infrastructure, particularly transportation, electricity. Okay, so we had the nationalization of roads for transport in 1973. And if you look at transportation, it's also important to keep in mind that the state policies as a whole have emphasized minor roads, that is roads which connect villages to nearby towns and connect villages to nearby villages. you find that the amount of emphasis given to minor roads is much more than most other states, and this again will have a role in how rural transformation has played itself out. Then there has always been an emphasis on primary education and primary health care. Traditionally, this argument at the all India level has been that in the investments in education and healthcare have an elite bias. That is, tend to privilege people who already can access primary education, help people who already have access to, basic healthcare. But in Tamil Nadu, you find that there are some of these elements have been reversed. So there has been an emphasis on primary education and healthcare, and which can be seen in terms of outcomes vis-a-vis better literacy rates and enrollment ratios at different levels of education. The other major axis, of course, is social welfare policies, social protection policies, and clearly the universal public distribution system and the noon meal scheme are the most the flagship kind of schemes, apart from schemes implemented by the union government, like the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. Now, coming to so with this, we can take a look at what is happening or what are the broad trends in Tamil Nadu's rural economy. I'll just start with agriculture. Okay, so the first point to make is that land markets have become very active. You find large amounts of land sales happening based on market considerations. That is this modernization of land markets, which we started out with. But having said that, you do not find land holdings getting consolidated as one would expect, right? In other words, you would expect that land markets will facilitate consolidation of land holdings to an optimal size from the point of view of economic efficiency and productivity. But you don't find that happening. So instead, according to the latest situation assessment of households survey, the NSS 77th round, which gives data for the year 2018-19, you find that 93% of rural land holdings are marginal and 5% are small land holdings. Okay. See, there is a distinction here. Okay, I'll come back to that in a bit. So second important point is that Tamil Nadu has got one of the lowest average land holding size. It's about 0.7 hectares, which is again one of the lowest in the country, which means that this land per se, as an agriculture household, the amount of land that I have access to or cultivate upon is very, very small and may not allow me to actually secure a decent livelihood. Okay. Landlordism as a phenomenon has declined in most parts of the state. So you don't, very rarely do you find, very rich landlords in a particular village and exercising control over the village economy as it used to happen in the past. Another important thing is labor relations, which are again, very, very driven by caste relations and so on, have been undermined over a period of time. And an important policy intervention that has facilitated this is the public distribution system, because traditionally control over labor, particularly in rural Tamil Nadu, was exercised through control over food. You would work on the farm, and based on which you will get food in return, as compensation for your labor exercise. Now, the public distribution system, but directly, reaching food to agriculture landless workers, undermines the ability of the landed households to exercise control on the labor of agriculture labor. So agriculture laborers have become relatively free. They're free to sell their labor to whomever they want to, and that need not be only within agriculture. They can also kind of move to the non-farm as well. And production is highly commercialized. Technologies, Tamil Nadu has witnessed rapid diffusion of new technology within agriculture, so much so that it may be of some surprise to note that, in fact, for most crops that Tamil Nadu specializes in, such as paddy, maize, vegetables, and fruits, you would find that yields are comparable with among the best in the country, despite the fact we have issues with water. So this improvement in productivity, agriculture productivity, has been driven by extensive groundwater extraction. We do know that bulk of this cultivation is increasingly the share of cultivation that relies on groundwater, particularly tube-well based irrigation, has increased enormously in the last 20 years, and which also comes up with a set of problems. Yeah, we do know that people dig deeper and deeper tube wells, and often these tube wells collapse after a few months. So the investment costs high, and it also poses a lot of risk. And this has also been aided by rural electrification infrastructure and also provision of free electricity to farmers, which has been around for a long time. But having said that, an important aspect of Tamil Nadu's rural economy is that it has one of the lowest share of agricultural households within rural households and among rural households. Now, how are agriculture households defined? According to the NSS 77th round, any household where at least one member reports that he or she gets income primarily from cultivation. That is for the first criterion. The second criterion is that at the household level, at least agriculture should fetch an annual income of 5,000 rupees. Even if I get 5,000 rupees annually from agriculture, and at least one member of the household says that yes, I primarily get my income from agriculture, then that household gets classified as a agriculture household. Okay. So now, as per 2018-19, in Tamil Nadu, only 26.4% of rural households can be defined as agriculture households. That is wherein agriculture continues to be a significant source of income for these households. That's only about, which means that 2/3 of the households are non-agriculture households. It doesn't mean that agriculture plays no role in the remaining, almost 75% of the households. They do play a role, but the role is much lower. Okay, that is one. And this is much lower because if you look at the all India average, rural households, almost 54% of rural households have been classified as agriculture households, whereas in Tamil Nadu is only 26, which is almost half of this thing. Now, if you look at the caste differences within Tamil Nadu's agrarian rural economy, what you find is that scheduled castes account for close to 30% of all rural households, but only 18% of agriculture households. In other words, 60% of scheduled caste households in rural Tamil Nadu are agriculture households. Whereas for the backward caste households, only 45% of the households are agriculture households. Okay, which means that scheduled caste households, but I'm talking only about agriculture households. Okay, you'd find that a greater share of agriculture households among scheduled caste, greater share of scheduled caste households tend to be agriculture households. Second, if you look at the average household size, the scheduled caste household size is 4.2, but they own on an average landholding size of 1.19 acre. This is excluding homestead land. Whereas if you look at backward caste households, the average size is not too different. It's about 3.9, but nevertheless, they own slightly higher. That is 1.96 acres on an average. So for scheduled caste households is 1.19 acres, whereas for the backward caste households, the average is 1.96 acres. But the key thing to remember is both there is a difference, but on the whole, the average landholding size is really low. Yeah, that's the key inference that we should make. Similarly, 85% of scheduled caste households own marginal landholdings, whereas 72% of backward caste households owns marginal landholdings. Again, there's not even small farmers, bulk of them are marginal landholders. Another important point, which is again worth taking on board when you go to the field, is nearly 40% of operational landholdings of scheduled castes and 32% of backward caste landholdings report no cultivation. That is, they have land, but they've reported that they have not cultivated in this past year. So the question we need to ask clearly is why. The reasons may vary at the ground level, which is what the kind of studies that you would be undertaking would be very, very important. But on an average, it's possible to surmise that the returns from agriculture are so low in relative terms. Okay, and that can explain why agricultural households are not willing to expend labor in agriculture when the opportunity cost of that is higher in terms of going to work in construction, getting income from other kinds of sources and so on. So okay, I will. So if we look at this, I'm just looking at slight away from agriculture. You find that yes, we have highly productive and so on, but the cost of cultivation in Tamil Nadu is also high because agriculture is highly commercialized. And as I mentioned earlier, the reliance on groundwater is also adding to the cost of production. So what you find is productivity is increasing. Nevertheless, because of very, very fragmented household size, you find that there's very little surplus being generated from agriculture. That is, you're not households at the household level. I can't say that bulk of the households are making a profit, and their profit they're investing in some other activity outside agriculture, which is help them diversify, improve incomes, and so on. So there is a limit to which surplus diversification is taking place from agriculture at the household level. As a result of which, agriculture households cannot reproduce themselves from one generation to the other. Clearly, if I don't have enough income from agriculture, I keep looking for other options. And you reach a point where that, because we do know agriculture production is primarily the organizational form through which agriculture is being cultivated is the family farm. Yeah. Now, within a family, if you find that agriculture does not sustain this family, members of the family are likely to look for employment avenues elsewhere. And once they go for employment elsewhere, family labor for cultivation diminishes. So this reproduction of this family farm as an institution within agriculture, is not viable anymore. So you find that kind of happening. You find huge amounts of diversification outside agriculture. So two kinds of diversification, as I started with earlier. One, diversification within the rural, and then you also find rural to urban movement. Now, if you look at employment, what you find is, yes, people are diversifying, but bulk of this employment is of casual nature, especially for scheduled caste households. 60% of rural households among scheduled caste households are engaged in casual labor. This rate is much lower for backward caste households, which is only about 36%. But for both scheduled caste households and backward caste households, regular salaried employment is meager. It's not surprising, but it's worth keeping in mind. So regular salaried employment is only 15% for scheduled caste households and 20% for backward caste households. One area again where backward castes tend to have a higher share is self-employment. Self-employment, you find backward caste household registering about 37%, whereas it's only 18% in the case of scheduled caste households. And if you look at income from average income for an agriculture household, according to this survey, it's about 11,924 rupees per month. I'm sorry, I'm not sharing the slides with you. It's slightly chaotic. So I've told Dr. Malati, I will just polish it up and share it with all of you, either by tonight or tomorrow. So the key point to make, we look at the composition of agriculture household income is that out of nearly 12,000 rupees, 6,500 rupees comes from wages. Yeah, so which means that bulk of income, even for an agriculture household, comes only from wages. 2,600 rupees comes from cultivation, 2,000 from farming of animals, and 715 from non-farm business. Okay, this composition varies between scheduled caste households and backward caste households, primarily in terms of crop production and farming of animals. You find scheduled caste households tend to be involved in a larger magnitude in the domain of animal farming, that is poultry. whereas you find a greater share of backward caste households getting more income from non-farm business than scheduled caste households. Okay, so this is primarily the difference. But in terms of wages, it does not much of a difference, except for the fact that scheduled caste households tend to have more casual work rather than self-employment. So given this, because of low incomes in agriculture, you would also expect rural poverty rates to be low. But thanks to social welfare schemes, particularly the universal PDS, you find that rural poverty rates are one of the lowest in the country. In fact, a study by Jean Reyes and Ritika Kera, this is slightly dated in 2013. Unfortunately, we don't have more recent data. It shows that universal public distribution system accounted for a reduction of absolute poverty by 44.4% in rural Tamil Nadu. So in other words, despite modernization of agriculture, despite rapid incorporation of technologies and improvement in output, social welfare interventions are very, very crucial for keeping people above the poverty line in rural Tamil Nadu. In fact, if you look at the distribution of population who are multidimensionally poor, as per the recent Niti Aayog index, you'll find that the top 10 districts, which have the relatively higher levels of poverty, are districts where agriculture has a much higher share in the district GDP, compared to other districts. Like if you look at the entire East Coast, starting from Viluppuram, Aryalur, Perambalur, Nagapattinam, Tiruvarur, Tanjavur, all of them, come under have some of the highest Pudukkottai. They all have some of the highest, multidimensional poor population in state. So if you look at diversification, primarily through two routes, one is through shift of low-skilled labor to other sectors. Primarily, it's construction. If you look at people who are leaving agriculture and moving into non-agriculture with lower educational qualifications, you would find that construction is the biggest source of employment. Okay, and then you have loan services. You might roadside vending and so on and so forth. So that might be done by women. So you find this is one kind of diversification that is happening. And this is also possible because of the transportation infrastructure. And people are able to move, labor relations are relatively lax, so people are able to leave rural areas and go to work. But nevertheless, what you find is there's a continuous back and forth movement between the rural and the urban and the rural. What you find is the phenomenon of the commuting worker, becoming very, very significant in rural Tamil Nadu. You would find that often people go to work from rural Tamil Nadu, migrate to work in nearby towns or slightly far off places. And the time duration may vary. It can be an everyday kind of a commute. It can be commuting for a week or a month or a couple of months. If you work in brick kilns, it might be even more. Or for construction, it can be just for a month and so on. So you find migration being of multiple kinds being a very important phenomenon for rural Tamil Nadu. Okay, and what it means for the ability to access services is something which would be important to kind of look into. So, and sometimes when people go to work long term, and then suddenly something goes wrong in the urban areas, they might lose a job, or the company might be closed down. Of course, the pandemic clearly illustrated the precarity of bulk of urban employment as well. Yeah, so many of them kind of come back, and what that means is something again is worth keeping in mind. So often what you find is for a rural household, both farm incomes and non-farm incomes, it can be rural non-farm or urban non-farm, they feed into each other. Some money which you earn from working in construction or outside might go into investment in agriculture, or a good year where you might be able to make profits in agriculture might help the household invest in education or payment of some capitation fees, to get their children into college or polytechnics and so on. So the second important nature of diversification is obviously through investments in education. Again, we do know our gross enrollment ratio in tertiary education is is the highest in the country, and more than 50% of youth are employed in some or engaged in some form of higher education as the other. And so this is highly aspirational kind of investments that households make, including rural households. And in fact, if you look at the public sector loans going to education, for educational loans, you would find that Tamil Nadu has the highest share, in the entire country, which means that households, including rural households, I don't have the breakup between rural and urban households as far as education loans is concerned. But what you find is that households are borrowing heavily to invest in education, hoping that this will be the route to a better future. So often that investments do not actually translate into decent employment opportunities. Yeah. So why is that the case? That is something we can talk about. I'm not talking about the fact that employment intensity in manufacturing and in services is falling, one, and then two, the quality of jobs that are being generated is not particularly attractive. Often you get jobs of about 10 to 12,000 rupees, which is not enough to sustain a household at all. This is a major problem. I mean, I will not talk about this for the time being. If we just look from the service delivery point of view, if we look at just education, though on an average 62% of students in Tamil Nadu go to government institutions, in rural areas it is much higher. 73% of students in rural areas are in government institutions, okay, whereas it's only 50% in urban areas. And you also find that there is the proportion of students in government institutions progressively declines across social groups, starting from scheduled tribes, scheduled castes, then most backward castes, and others. If you look at this progression, you'd find that those at the bottom end of the social hierarchy tend to disproportionately rely on government schools. This is particularly so in rural areas. Okay. The other important thing that you find is, though at present, students from socially lower social groups tend to study in Tamil medium more than in English medium, you find there's a gradual shift towards a preference for English medium. Yeah. And for that, to that extent, there is also a decline of, there is a decline of students from rural Tamil Nadu, depending on government institutions. There has been an increase, in fact, of, households trying to send their children to private schools, hoping that the learning outcomes will be better, and that will really help them realize a better employment future. Nevertheless, you find that school to work transitions are hugely problematic, especially in rural Tamil Nadu. So what you find is there is this category called NEET, that is not the entrance exam, which is controversy going on. This category is called those who are neither in employment nor in education or training. Okay, that is, I'm not in education, I'm not involved in any kind of training like ITI or working in a company to train. I'm not in any kind of job. Basically, it gives you an indicator of the people who do not not able to get anything done. You find that, I mean, this data is slightly, it pertains only to 2011-12, but you find that nearly 29% of rural youth males who have a graduate degree and above belong to this category. Okay, that is, they're not been able to, they're neither in employment nor in education. And this is much higher for girls, who are in the age of 15 to 24. It's about 38%. 38% of girls who are graduates and above, but neither in education employment, is very stark. So one might always say that, in the case of girls, probably households tend to marry them off, so they may not be able to seek paid employment. But the fact that nearly 29% of rural youth with a graduate degree are not able to find jobs is the biggest challenge that we are facing in Tamil Nadu. The challenge clearly is that, yes, we have been able to diversify considerably, but we have not been able to completely make the urban transition. Yeah, households are investing in education, they're trying to diversify out of agriculture, but you don't find them completely moving to the urban, where the future is relatively more secure. You get a regular job, you move the entire family to the urban, that kind of a process is not happening, which in fact, the rural and urban linkages are very, very critical to provide some kind of income and economic security to rural households in Tamil Nadu. And how shocks in the urban impact the rural is something, we have anecdotal evidence, but it will be worth looking into, when you undertake primary field work. And the important point to keep in mind is this insecurity or this negative aspects of rural transformation is happening despite the fact that we've invested considerably in human capital formation. Yeah. So there are two issues in this then. So one is whether the quality of human capital is good enough to be employable. That is something which the industry voices, keep referring to, right? Graduates are many, but they're unemployable. The question that we need to ask is that the primary reason why youth are not able to get jobs which are attractive enough? My hunch is that this is not the primary factor. In fact, the challenge for most companies and for most youth is not that they don't get jobs, but the jobs that they get are not good enough to sustain them in the long run. One, the wages are relatively low. Second, the career options, it's okay, if I get a job, but which pays me 8,000 rupees or 10,000 rupees now, but 5 years from now, I may be able to get a secure job which pays me about 25,000 rupees or so. If I don't see that future, then the reluctance, I'll be very reluctant to take up a job which which is low paying to begin with and gives me no better future. The other important issue is, particularly in rural Tamil Nadu, is stagnation in women's workforce participation. We do have the highest rates, one of the highest rates of labor force participation of women in Tamil Nadu for a long time. But you do find that it is not increasing. There has been a fall in urban rural workforce participation, but in rural workforce participation, there is a stagnation. But having said that, we should also remember that unlike in other states where one talks of workforce participation in rural areas for women, generally one talks about employment in agriculture. Yeah. Now, it is true that employment in agriculture all over the country, including in Tamil Nadu, has fallen in the sense that agriculture output is employment elasticity within agriculture has fallen. In other words, though agriculture output increases, I'm able to produce more output year on year. I'm able to do that using less and less labor compared to what I used to in the past. Yeah. So which means that there is much little scope for employment within agriculture. So in Tamil Nadu, that can partly explain stagnation in women's workforce participation. But Tamil Nadu is different from other states in the sense that we also have a significant presence of industries in rural areas. You find large number of garment factories, shoe factories, other leather goods factories, and assembly units in in the districts bordering Chennai, where women are engaged in relatively higher numbers. So despite that, you find stagnation in women's work participation. That's something which we need to look into. We also know that average wages that women get is lower compared to what men get for the jobs that they enter in. Then there is this issue of differentiation through quality of education. Yeah, perceived or real. There is a strong sense that students who access government schooling tend to have poorer quality of education. Secondary data doesn't actually tell us that, but there's a very strong perception that private schools are better. And having said that, given the fact that lower social groups tend to, by and large, be dependent on public schooling, there is an issue there. Affirmative action policies for which the state is known for, because of large-scale privatization, there are clear-cut limits. In addition to this, if you look at some of the issues for service delivery, habitations within a village, we need to be very, very careful about. We do know that there are caste-based segregation exists in several rural parts of Tamil Nadu. So to what extent service delivery between different habitations within a revenue village exists is something, which is worth looking into. And ICDS functioning, we visited a few Anganwadi centers. See, clearly they do function much better compared to Anganwadi centers in other parts of the country. Maybe Kerala does better, but by and large we do well. But given the fact that early childhood learning and early childhood nutrition is very, very significant and has huge amount of multiplier effects in the long run, a lot more needs to be done than what is happening at the moment. Healthcare, again, there's a, though public health system is good, there is a growing preference for private healthcare even in rural Tamil Nadu. That is something that we need to kind of look into. Aging is another important aspect. Tamil Nadu is a fast aging population, and the dependence ratio is pretty high. And what it means for vulnerability of this old age people in rural Tamil Nadu is something that needs worth exploring. And for service delivery, and especially following the pandemic, there is an excessive emphasis on use of digital technologies. Now, digital technologies are wonderful. I mean, they do many things. They minimize effort in many ways, but they also generate exclusions. There's a recent paper by Hyade Nave and Grace Carswell on how use of digital technologies in public delivery of ration rice, creates exclusions because of glitches in the way the system operates, how messaging is kind of done, and who is able to see the message. And suppose you get a message saying that rations have been delivered, but actually it has not been done. How can you go about addressing it? Because the interface is completely digital. These are all kind of issues which generate a set of exclusions. So what kinds of exclusions the digital technologies, when use of digital technologies in public service delivery create is something worth looking into. The other issue is housing. There are Tamil Nadu government has invested heavily in providing loans for housing, but often you find that the total money that is kind of allotted is lower given the aspirations of the people who want to build these houses. So often you find rural households starting to construct but leaving it halfway through because they don't have any more money, and they kind of borrow heavily from the informal markets, leading to all kinds of issues. Yeah, so I'll stop with this, and we can take up any issues for discussion. And again, apologies for not being able to share the slides, but I shall do so by latest by tomorrow. Thank you.
Sir, thank you so much for that excellent and inspiring information. And thanks for throwing light on different facets about rural areas. In a short time, you were able to tell about focus on agriculture, service delivery, work participation, all this information. Definitely, it will be very useful for us for our project. Can you please, can we have an interaction session, sir, please?
Sure. Happy to. Yeah.
So I think I'll start with the first question. I want to ask you two questions.
Yeah.
One is related to our project, because our project is accessing public utilities in the rural development. So that is the important thing. According to you, you must have done several research, especially in rural areas, I know that. And which public utility do you think have to be improved in rural area? Where the concentration of the government, the present government, needs to focus more on which public utility do you think? So that is my first question. And the second one, you said about the stagnation of women participation in rural areas. You said that there's been a declining. What are the reasons? Can you, just tell the reasons? That is one thing. And just one more, sir, please. Sir, we have e-marketing in Karnataka, which is really doing very well. Like we have e-mandis and all that.
Right.
How can we follow that in agriculture sector in Tamil Nadu? When you talk about digital technology, of course, that is there. But e-marketing can play a very important role, because I read a paper about e-marketing in Karnataka model. So they are doing really very good in e-marketing, e-mandi. So why can't we follow that? Yes.
So yeah, in terms of service delivery, which is most critical, I mean, see, this is based on my very limited kind of experience on the ground. See, on the healthcare front, we are not too bad, in the sense, yes, I mean, resources are stretched, equipment, especially the last few years, and then ability to replace equipment is not possible. Sometimes buildings, maintenance is not good. See, one thing cutting across all these service delivery is a lack of emphasis on operations and maintenance. Because often you build a structure and then there's hardly any funds or any monitoring of this maintenance of these assets, and that you find that very striking. Sometimes some of the buildings which are done in the private sector, which has lasted for 40-50 years, they are much better compared to buildings which have been built in the public sector within the last 20-25 years. Of course, quality of construction itself may be an issue, but operation and maintenance, particularly for schools and hospitals, we need to kind of emphasize, and then that is a big lacuna. That is kind of cutting across everything. But in terms of actual service delivery, I would probably say education, is kind of fundamental. And I think particularly after the pandemic, people have been talking about how almost for 2 years, there's been a complete loss of, whatever learning. And when I was interacting with the people from, ITIs and polytechnics, and they're saying they can see the difference in the kind of students who have come now compared to, say, 2 years ago. Their ability to even, read and write sentences. Even just one simple sentence to read or write very fast. Earlier, they would say out of 100, you would see only 4 or 5. But now they say 30, 40 of the students who are currently coming, have this problem. So that's something, which for me, it is very, very important. And one talks about education is also about early childhood learning through Anganwadi centers. Anganwadi centers are well equipped with learning materials and so on. The extent to which they're actually being used is something, which is at least for you to kind of, tell us. That's why even for your own scope of a study, I think while you study these 30 odd villages, I think it's also useful to have a comparative perspective, take some, at least if you say 3 or 4 districts, where you have a village which is relatively closer to a town, and then see, how public service delivery functions and how different or how better they are. And what explains this, is it the distance or is it something else? I think if you're able to incorporate that, or even reduce the number of the smaller villages, and then, have a comparative frame, I think that would throw a lot of light. Is be my this thing. We can discuss this later. Now, women's workforce participation. See, I don't really have clear-cut answers. See, one of course has to do with the fact that employment in agriculture itself has declined. Yeah. Number of days of employment availability. I might get employment, but often, it's for the number of days or number of hours for you get employment within agriculture over a year has fallen, particularly when it comes to paddy and so on. In horticulture, things are different, but if you look at paddy and like sugar cane and so on, find it has kind of come down. Now, but alternate employment, what you find is that there tends to be withdrawal, hoping that you'll use their human capital, because some of them are educated and all of it, to help educate their children. Wherever possible, they're trying to kind of do that. The other major factor is, see, non-farm employment is very much premised on your ability to move. You can take a bus, go work, or come back. Now, for women, still, patriarchal norms restrain the extent to which women can move, because they need to take care of domestic responsibilities and a whole range of factors. Again, this is only anecdotal, perceptive. My explanation is only based on perceptions. I think your work will show more light on that. And Dr. Maltin, e-mandis, I mean, I don't know enough. But clearly, e-marketing, is one important avenue to improve access to markets for farmers. And interestingly, see, Tamil Nadu also has a large number of farmers producer organizations. But somehow, I mean, again, I visited very few, and I might not be, it may not be fair on my part to pass a generalized kind of a thing. But what I find is that often these interventions are top down. NABARD wants it, somebody else wants it, they're giving money, then you come together. But somehow when that is kind of taken away, then the ability of this organization to engage, to ensure access to markets and so on, no, you don't find that happening. And some of them also do this online platform, digital selling and things of that kind. But why they're not doing that well, and especially compared to Karnataka, we definitely need to look into. And Karnataka, even before e-mandis, they did reasonably well in terms of marketing, fruits and vegetables through the Hopcoms initiative, through government retail outlets and so on. So probably they're able to leverage that. But as I said, I don't know enough, and yeah, I'm not the best person to.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you very much. Anybody else want to ask any questions, please?
Sir, good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, madam. Yeah.
This is Umameshwari, sir. Thank you for this wonderful lecture. You brought us very close to the subject, and it is now making us how do we really face the challenge, sir? Because this,
Yes.
the enormity of the subject matter that you have put forth today. So I have two
Right.
questions, sir.
Okay.
Since you have been doing so much of research, I just the very important question that crops up in my mind is, we have both the central government and the state government initiating very many policies. And what has been your kind of takeaway as to do they find that both the governments are able to bring in differentiation in their policies, or do you find there is again overlapping as we read in the books? Is it true, sir, when you see in the practical field work?
Okay. You
That's
had
the
one more
first.
question, right? Yeah.
Yes, sir. One more
Yeah.
question is like we have chosen around 22 to 25 public utilities, sir. And when we say development, usually say education, health, and we go for women empowerment, child, and all that. As far as that you have done so much of research, can you give us some kind of clue? Which is the area that requires more concentration
Sure.
that we could take it up?
Sure. Yeah. So in terms of policies, you're right. Especially in rural development, there are a huge number of schemes, which are run by the union government. Of course, the National Employment Guarantee scheme is the biggest. But in addition to that, you have any number of schemes, even like farmer producer organizations. There is also money coming in from the union government. Then you have state specific schemes. Now, see, when one talks about union government schemes, one has to be clear that often these schemes come with contribution from the state government. It's very rarely, except for the MGNREG. MGNREG also has a component which should be paid by the state government when we are not using labor. Any non-wage component, should be paid by the state government, but we don't have that, so we are okay on that front. But otherwise, most of the schemes also have require state governments also to pitch in some money. So the problem here is what you do is, okay, that is the scheme, and that once you get into that scheme, you're going to get some money from the union government. So state government officials apply, get it, and so on. And then which also requires some resources from the state government. The question that we need to ask, and for which I don't have clear-cut answers, is whether these schemes, the way they're designed, is necessarily the most optimal way of ensuring these outcomes for which these schemes have been designed for. I'm not very sure. See, because you have this thing. So the extent to which state governments have the flexibility, the autonomy to kind of modify the way it's being implemented, and whether that's actually being done is something, is worth looking into. And second, if there's no flexibility, then it's worth asking whether, because there's no flexibility, the schemes are actually not delivering optimal outcomes. That is something, worth looking into. In terms of conflict, I wouldn't think. See, often what happens is the schemes are often, very rare. What is one good thing that a state government does is we are able to dovetail we like Angan, we are the pioneers in early childhood, centers, and then ICDS came in. Then we became integrated Noonmeal scheme. So we have a way of dovetailing our schemes where we have been pioneers or innovators into ensuring that enough funds we get from the central government. That is something we have been able to do. But do we lose something when we do that? Is a question that is definitely worth asking. And can this be done differently? Is something which is again worth asking. Now, in terms of public utilities, madam, yeah. So clearly, okay. So drinking sanitation, given the fact our health outcomes are relatively poor, drinking water and sanitation is an issue, which is of utmost importance, because what we also realized is, and this is again based on very, very, what should I say, very limited conversations with health officials in rural Tamil Nadu, is that certain blocks, certain regions, the drinking water quality is poor, and it also leads to health issues like renal failures, fluorosis, and so on. So whether the departments in charge of service delivery at the panchayats, are aware of this issue. If yes, can they do something about it? Something is worth asking. And the other important thing is, of course, waste management. Because since it's rural areas, see, because in urban areas, when something goes wrong, it's very visible. You look at Peringudi dump yard, Kodingur dump yard, it kind of hits you in your face. But in rural areas, the biggest problem is that you can dissipate this waste, across fields, without actually people realizing, what's happening. So to what extent waste management by local bodies is cognizant of this possibility and the importance of actually, addressing the issue of waste, both solid and liquid waste, is something, which is worth looking into. And in terms of health and education, madam, and particularly education, so more than access, it is the quality issue. I think in Tamil Nadu, many of these things have second generation problems. Yeah, in most states in the north, even access might be a problem. Here, access is not an issue. Anybody can go to school, anybody can access the PHC. But the quality issues is something where we need to kind of focus on, and how it can be improved. For example, what we found is, for school education, a lot of students are shifting towards English medium, even in rural Tamil Nadu. But whether the quality of teachers who can deliver instructions, who can instruct students in English across subjects is good enough, the sense that I get is no. But it's very difficult, because the pool of teachers who are well trained in English in the particular subject is not many. So how do we kind of address that? Whether it can be done at the local level, or it requires large scale interventions. So these are all questions, which struck me, when I visited these rural areas. So I would again suggest education is a major issue. And the other thing, madam, is anemia. If you look at this rural, the multidimensional poverty, one biggest factor for multidimensional poverty in Tamil Nadu is anemia. Both among children and pregnant women. And now the interesting question to be asked again here is, there are so many interventions we have undertaken to address this question of anemia. We have the Muthulakshmi Reddy scheme, then we have this Poshan scheme, which talks about monitoring and giving iron supplements to school children. Despite all that, there seems to be a bottleneck. So something that one thing that struck us was, often students don't take this this iron tablets. Pregnant women don't take it as they're supposed to. Whether is that the only issue, or is it an issue at all, is something it'll be worth looking into when you go ahead with your field work. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Any other questions, please? Ma'am, so shall I call Eugene Rosita, madam, to propose the vote of thanks?
Okay, there's no questions.
Yes.
But yeah, we can proceed.
So I request Dr. Eugene Rosita from the Department of Education to propose the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Malti. I feel it's my pleasure and proud to propose vote of thanks to this program, which we are organizing as the second part of a project that is measuring the accessibility of public goods in rural areas, which has been delivered by our beloved professor, Dr. M. Vijay Pastor, Professor, Madras Institute of Development Studies, and also a member of State Planning Commission. Sir, indeed, we are feeling very privileged and honored to have you in our midst, sir. And talking about mentioning about your program, your presentation, you have given a very detailed information, which is really vital to take up this project, especially the economic diversification. And your speech has given us an information about understanding the structural transformation of Tamil Nadu, especially in terms of education, health, and other related aspects such as households and women's participation and aging population. We have thrown a clear-cut light. And also, I would like to mention, whenever you are talking and giving some vital information about the existing situation of Tamil Nadu in related to these aspects, you also mentioned about the gaps which also existing in the present scenario. So this helps us to understand a deep sense of planning for our project, sir. With this note, on behalf of our team, RUZA Team 3, our heartfelt thanks for sharing your wonderful time with us, sir. And then I would like to convey my thanks to Professor Gauri, Vice Chancellor of Madras University, and Professor Madhivanan, Registrar of Madras University, and Professor Bharati Harishankar, who put this initiative to start this RUZA project and ex-coordinator of RUZA, and Professor Madheshwaran, coordinator of RUZA, and above all, the backbone of our team, our team leader, Professor Uma Maheshwari. Thank you, ma'am, for driving us with a very energetic force. And also, I would like to thank our project investigators from 6 departments, Dr. Manju, Dr. Kamalarasan, Dr. Malati, Dr. Mariappan, for input to take up this project with an energetic mode. And I would also like to thank our PDF, Dr. Gopi, and our project fellows, our field investigators, and our technical support team. Above all, it is our immense pleasure to thank our participants from various institutions for the success of this workshop. Thanks a lot.